Hello, everyone. I am your host, Metro Meta, here to keep you centered. Today is September 14th, 2018. As I sit in my chair, a storm rages across North Carolina. But I'm here to keep you centered, and you're there to keep me safe. Our quote today comes from a book called Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi. I can't really, her name is hard. Don't know who it is. But, let's see. Tomi Medea. Tomi Amadea, I believe. It's an amazing book that we're going to talk about more later. But I love this quote, and it is, if I haven't read it yet, I won't let your ignorance silence my pain. Beautiful, beautiful message that we're gonna get really stuck into. So sit back, relax, and remember to rise above. Today we have a very special topic to discuss. We're going to be discussing the book that I got the quote from earlier, Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi, you know the name. I love this story so much. She's, those of you guys who don't know, Tomi's a sort of a new writer on the scene, graduated, I believe, from Howard. And she got a 6-figure deal for this book, which is pretty impressive considering she doesn't have any, big work outside of this, getting some sort of Harry Potter-esque deal for a series that wasn't really tested. There's a movie in the works, and I think it's time we discuss sort of why they're so entrenched in this and why it's so exciting and why it's so good. It's just because it's not just that there's fun characters and it's interesting and it's a cool world, but it's just such a good book. But let's start off with breakdown of what's going on. On Children of Blood and Bone, there are these individuals who have magical powers gifted to them by the gods, and it's passed down from generation to generation until eventually this evil king comes along and he starts killing them and hurting people and doing all this crazy stuff. And you follow the main character as she, her brother, and a princess travel across the country to restore magic and to save the world. It's classic journey, simple Middle-earth story, but it's so interesting partly because of the characters, because while this is a traditional fantasy Middle-earth story, the characters don't come off like that. They come off as sort of like modern children without iPhones, like little millennials in the freaking dark ages. And it's so much more refreshing than people who talk with thous and thens and thistles, and they never stand for anything and they don't really have any purpose to the world. They're just sort of vehicles for cosmic horrors that's going on. And there's a certain urgency and also a certain hatred around it. You see racism, and you very much get to experience racism, but they did the interesting thing of they took white people out of the equation. To my knowledge, I don't think there's a white character in the story, and so you see black on black crime, but it's framed as racism, and you sort of see it through a new lens. You don't have the historical hatred and hurt of 300 years of slavery, and you don't have anything like that, but you still see it's still detrimental, it's still a problem, and you can see how it affects people and how people came to believe it. And it's such a good, and the characters are really amazing. They're really great. You can really sort of see things. One of my big things, I do love a good love story. I love love stories, and in this story you can sort of see where the love stories are coming from and who's gonna be with who and what sort of things she's planting. But the difference is with her love stories, you both see them coming, and it also makes sense. Like, it makes sense that those two characters would start connecting with each other and wanting to be with each other. And it gives you a basis for you to believe what's going on and why things are going the way they are. So, sorry. What I would really like to talk about is its heavy themes and its heavy emphasis on the killing of African American children. It's very much a sort of what one would call, it's a parody, you know. It's a modest proposal in story form. It's the crucible in creative context, one might say. And it really, because one of the problems when you ever write fantasy is that fantasy's biggest problem is guns. Guns are a problem in fantasy because they eliminate the need for magic, and you have to plan around it. You have to plan around why are they still using spells and things like that if they have guns. You have to think about, well, what are the swords gonna do? What are these people doing? And modern technology and modern infrastructure really becomes the bane of somebody trying to make a fantastical fantasy world. And so what people tend to do is they go into the past. You know, you write it into the past. It makes sense in the past. That's why Lord of the Rings and all those things all take place generally in the same time period. You know, if you think about like most things, you know, they're happening in the same time period as around each other. Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, they all tend to be in the same time period. Comparatively speaking, whenever you put magic in the present, because of civilization, because of cell phones, because of swords and guns and modern technology, you sort of have to make a secret-like society for it. And it makes it so that the magic itself doesn't feel like part of this world, but an extension of it. And so what I love about her is she got around this, but to the point that I'm trying to make is that when you push things so far back into the past, you sort of lose some of the great modern ideals that we come up with, you know? Suddenly, things are thousands of years ago, and now women can't be fighting, and women can't be in the army. Now, all of a sudden, we're having to deal with all these major problems such as plague, not washing themselves. You can't manufacture an army of 2,000 people automatically. And it makes a problem to the effect that you have to create and plan a world around all that basically doesn't exist anymore. And you send the moral of the story and all these things into the past, and you lose a modern connection. But I like the way she writes it, because she didn't just go, and we're in the Dark Ages. Because that's another problem, is when they tend to put it in the past, they tend to put it in like a vaguely European area. And so now all of a sudden black people don't exist. There's no Hispanics, there's no Asians. It's just white people and elves. And it's not fun, it's not very connective to what you want your world to look like. And it's not good for diversity, of course, obviously. And so what I like her, and of course authors like Nita, do is that they work to build things not with just traditional European culture, but they work with African culture. They work with their own cultures, and they also work with African American culture. And I think that's something that we're going to see a lot more of, is these more cultural fantasies. You know, there's of course the genre of Afro sci-fi, African American or African science fiction that Nita has made popular, and that has also been seen in like things like Black Panther. But I like this book because it's sort of like Afro fantasy. You know, it's African fantasy using African culture and African ideals and themes to build fantasy. And it's a beautiful story. You should all check it out. It's a #1 seller, and it really deserves the accolades it's getting, and even more so. So, check out Children of Blood and Bone. If I had to review it, 10 out of 10, IGN, let's get it. As we come to a close, I'd like for our final discussion today to be more in depth on that quote. Don't let their ignorance silence your pain. So often nowadays, you get on these fights on the internet and you're just so passionate and you're so mad, but the person you're talking to just doesn't, they're just not smart enough to figure out the meaning or why you're saying or doing something. And they just don't know enough for them to actually argue with you, and it feels hopeless, and then you just give up, and people give up and they stop trying. And we need to not do that, because when you give up, you're giving them the power. They get to spend the rest of their lives believing that they were right, even if they were incredibly wrong. It's why every single time people just shout out Confederacy, it's about white power, it's about white heritage, and people go, that's not heritage, that's not it's just pain. That's all that is pain in history. People don't see that anymore. They see this mixed, confused concoction of historical lies and personal feelings that they've blended together to make some weird alternate history where the South wasn't fighting for slavery and where the Civil War was just a modest disagreement between two gentlemanly parts. They forget that those people were traitors, that they betrayed their country, that they tried to leave, that they should not be warranted, they should not be celebrated. They forget what it means to be American, and then they call themselves the most American. There's this sense of people who go, MAGA, MAGA, make America great again. They think back to this 1960s, 1950s lifestyle where the jock football player was some cool, good-looking white kid just hanging around all the girls and doing whatever he wanted on his car, where women were lovely housewives, a time before women could vote or drive or be actual human beings, back when black people were just mitigated to the sides of society, where the big high school football game was the biggest thing in town. But the problem with it is that is a lie, and it never existed and it never will exist again. And that behind that weird alternate history you made for yourself is the thousands upon hundreds upon millions of individuals who are crying out in pain, who are living awful lives that they can never get back. And you're just sitting there saying, this is what we want to go back to. This is how we want to live. You're forgetting what was actually going on during those times. You're forgetting that this was a time where it wasn't good for you to be black. It wasn't good for you to be female. Hell, even the white men, if you weren't rich, probably were getting ripped off and hurt at the exact same time. This country has a problem with seeing ourselves as the hero of everything. We celebrate ourselves. We took down the Nazis. We took down the concentration camps. Meanwhile, we put our Japanese citizens in concentration camps. We say he's bad, he did all this testing, he did all this experimentation on the Jews. Meanwhile, we forget that that is the basis of most modern medicine. We forget that there was a time in this country where a black woman couldn't go to the doctor because she was afraid that she'd go to sleep, or he'd put her to sleep and then he'd take out her reproductive organs because he thought she wasn't viable. We forget that there was a time in this country where 100 black men were tested to see if syphilis would affect black people differently, not because they already had syphilis, they gave that to them, not because it was a scientific study. No, they just thought black people were dumb and there's no way they could die like a white person, and that a cure was found for them partway through, and they refused to give it to them just because they wanted to test this. We forget that this was the country that helped support many of the Nazis. Many of the Nazis' concentration and medical camps, all that was partially funded by America, because even after he was found to be a monster, there were people who were celebrating him. There were people who said he brought Germany back. There are people who are willing to make concessions because of what he's done, and that's a dangerous ideal to play with, you know? I think that's part of the reason why Trump is successful now. You know, when Hitler's coming up, blame all the Jews, hurt all the Jews, kill all the Jews. But because he was getting so many great results, people were okay with what he was doing and what he was saying, because he was doing so many great things. That's the problem with Trump, is that if he starts doing well, people are going to go, well, he's racist, but I got a job, I don't care. Well, he's sexist, but you know what? Me Too's out there, and we can rely on them, and we become this bog of lies and hatred. We are allowing for people's ignorance, for the ignorance of these people to not know their history, to not know their facts, to not know logic, to not know what it actually means to be an American. And we're using that as a justification for not bringing up pain. People talk about Colin Kaepernick, and they talk about him kneeling and all that stuff. But what they're not talking about, and what they don't deal with, is if you're so worried about the veterans, why are there so many on the streets? If you're so worried about the veterans, how come none of them can get the right healthcare? How come veterans who have proven that things like marijuana can help them and help deal with their problems can't have access to it unless they're buying a drug dealer? The people who are supporting and looking out for our veterans need to be our greatest and our best medical officers, not 2 Chainz from the streets. We need to actually look at how we treat our veterans and how we do things, but people don't want that. They just want to look nice. They just want to look at the parade. They want to be part of the party and not part of the solution. They want to look good, be well, and do nothing. And it's not okay anymore. We need to stop hurting people and then forgetting we hurt them. We need to stop hurting everything around us just to get away with it. Just for a few minuscule moments of people's own pleasure. Why is there an epidemic of guns and violence in our school if we're not going to do anything about it? This got onto a big rant. Perhaps that's what it needs to be. But there's a storm coming soon. I better get off. Until then, like, comment, and subscribe. I'd like to give a shout out to 26 and Glencoe Media. And remember to rise above.